Now that we have developed some understanding of the interface of Lightroom's develop module as well as Adobe Camera Raws, let's begin the development process. So as a matter of habit, personally speaking, I always have my clipping warnings on the histogram checked, just in case something goes haywire, so it'll give me a visual indicator. So the left being the shadow clipping warning, the right one being the highlight clipping warning. So now that's that done. Personally, once again, different people have different ways of approaching it, but there's no what you need to do first or last. I'm going to choose one of these images to work with. So the first thing that I will do is activate the lens profile and check remove chromatic aberration. And notice that it identifies the make, the actual lens, and the profile that's available for it. And that's about it. So once having done this, I collapse it and I go to my basic panel. When I look at the histogram, there's a fair bit of clipping happening in the shadow. So one quick keyboard shortcut is on the Mac, if you keep the Alt Option key pressed and click on exposure, highlight, shadow, then what it'll do is it'll basically show you where you're going. So as I am intentionally moving it to the right, so now it starts to tell me that I'm clipped in the highlight. So I'm not interested in going that far out, so I open it up a little bit and I see what the behavior is. And we can go back and forth between controls. So once I do this, my highlight is a little too hot and my shadows are still missing. So I may wish to come here and pull the highlight gently down and open up some of the shadows and some of the blacks. Maybe pull back a little bit of the white. So this is one way of going about it. Now, the area that I'm concerned with is out here. So when I look at the details over here, notice there's a tiny bit of red dots showing up, which imply that there's some clipping going on. So I may wish to pull back a little bit on the exposure. Okay, now the overall image may go a little dark, and at which point in time we can then either open the shadows a little bit or a combination of shadows and blacks. Now if I now go look at the histogram, notice there's no clipping on the left and there's no clipping on the right either. So at a base level, the basic adjustment seems to be pretty okay. Let's enlarge the facial region and see what is happening here. Everything looks good. I don't have a problem. One could look into clarity, dehaze, vibrance, and saturation. So what will clarity do? So notice it sharpens the image and it creates a little bit more of contrast in there. So a tiny bit of clarity may help the image a little bit. Dehaze I'm not going to bother with at this point in time. So I'm quite happy with what I'm seeing here. If I reduce the image, then I go back. Perhaps there's a bit too much light on her hands, so I may wish to tone this down just a tiny bit. So how do I go about it? So this is where the adjustment brush comes in very handy. So what I personally again like to do, and it's a choice that you make once you develop some familiarity with the tool, is once I've chosen the brush, there's an auto mask button, checkbox. I will check that. And at the same time, I like to see where I am painting the mask on, where the change will be impacted. So I'm basically looking to bring it down a little bit, so close to half a stop or so to start. I again would like to control the flow to about 50% and the density as well, somewhere in there. Okay, and then choose an appropriate size brush. So the size of the brush can be adjusted using the slider, or you can use the square brackets. So the right square bracket will increase the brush size, the left square bracket will reduce the brush size. So I'm pressing the right square bracket. Now if you notice, there's a faint outline to the circle, perhaps there against black, you see that. That's the range of feathering that is available to you. The outer circle reflects the amount of feathering that will be applied. And you can always modify the feathering by using the sliders, or if you keep the shift key pressed, and while the shift key is pressed, if you wish to increase the feathering, the right square bracket will increase the feathering, the left square bracket will reduce the feathering. So I have chosen an appropriate brush size, which is about here, and I am going to paint. So as I paint, you will notice a magenta color start to appear in there. And I'm not being too careful whether I spill out or not, because that is something that is completely controllable. So I am painting away. There's a very subtle red that you can see in there, which is primarily the mask. So once you have completely covered it, and I want to make sure that I get all of it, I will then go and say uncheck show selected mask. So notice we had reduced it by half a stop roughly. I'm just going to demonstrate by reducing it more so you can see the behavior. So you don't really want to go too dark. It wouldn't be a bad idea to reduce the image a little bit and then see where and what the behavior may be. So I'm simply going to go fill and then check it out, or even fit, to see whether her hands are a similar skin tone as her face is. So the tone is okay, the color on the face is not quite there as yet because there's makeup on the facial area, no makeup over here, so the tone may be slightly different, so we're going to fix that later on. So once this is adjusted to the point, I can then go hit the done button. That's one. Now I wish to see if I can match the facial tone somewhat to what the hand tone is. So if I open up my histogram and I bring my cursor in the highlight region over here, you can see the RGB values in percentage just beneath the histogram over here. You will notice that as I keep the cursor around here. So I'm going to make note of the values just for my own reference. So it's 75 red and 65.8 green and 55.4 blue. So I have made a note so that I don't forget. So it's just a sticky that I've put up here, and then I'll go to the facial region and then keep my cursor on the highlight to see what the difference is. So my red is at 83.3 currently, green is at 75, and blue is at 64.5. So I move around just to sort of get an idea of where I can find a relatively equal value, close enough. Okay, so now I have a value of 75.6, 65.1, 53.3. My original tone on the hand was 75 in the reds, 65.8 in the green, and 55.4 in the blue. So the lack of blue implies that there is perhaps just a tiny bit of yellow, just a tiny bit. So it's 53.3 currently, and in the hand it was 55.4. So Can I potentially change that? I would like to believe yes. So once again, what I'm going to do is take the adjustment brush, but this time, since it's a larger surface, I am simply going to increase the brush size. I'm going to leave the feather and flow and density the same, not changing very much, and start off just about there. And sorry, I forgot to check this so that we can see where the mask is impacting. So you can see the red mask go on over there. And I continue to do this. And don't forget one thing, that while I'm painting this, I had checked AutoMask. So what AutoMask does is it kind of keeps the mask in the space of the color that you're painting on. Okay, so keep that in mind. It's a nice, easy way of ensuring, or at least starting off, that the mask doesn't spill over. So in this case, the mask has not spilled over anywhere. So I don't have to bother with anything else. I uncheck this. And now what I want to do is increase the blue tone in a very, very slight bit. So I'll come and modify the temperature just by a little bit. So if I were to increase it, you can see how cold the facial features may, if the skin tone may become. And remember where we were at, so I'm going to try and find a similar value in the 70s. So 75 was the original on the hand, so I'm moving it. There we go. So now I have 75, which is exactly what the hand value was. Green is 65.5, so 0.3 differential, I don't care about that. And blue was 55.4, and currently it is 56.2. So maybe just a hint back, and then bring it again to see where you're at. And I am going to continue with that value change. There we go. 55.1 and 55.4. 55.4 was on the hand. So having done this, I hit done and zoom out. And even visually, I can tell that the skin tone appears to be better. Now, to be able to see what exactly has transpired, let's do a before and after. So I can do a left side and right side before and after. Before it was this, currently it is this. So I go back to my single view, and now I start looking at some other areas where I feel that I can pull up a little bit more detail and perhaps add some more value. Okay, so notice this beautiful highlight on her hair, and how there's highlights here, some shadows over here. So I would like to do some more retouching in this region. So I'm going to reduce it a little bit, which is enough, and take a new exposure adjustment brush, size it down, and once again I have lowered feathering, lowered flow, and lowered density. I am going to gently paint very carefully to avoid any spillover, and it's not a bad idea to activate show selected mask overlay so you can see what's going on. And there's dark shadows in here, so here I'm going to further reduce the density of the same brush as I'm coming closer to the skin, so the influence will be a lot lighter. And that seems about right. And at the same time, a tiny hint over here, and perhaps a little bit in here, because these are pretty dark spaces. So the idea is to do a kind of a clean, good looking, well detailed image. Now that I have this, I can modify stuff. So I say, okay, uncheck this so that that disappears. And this time around, I am at 0 exposure. Everything is set to 0. What if I open the shadows a little bit? I'm going to exaggerate. So you can see a very soft change, which is a pleasant change. Or I can also take my blacks, and if I do an extreme changeover, then you can see the details start to show up. So I don't want to do too extreme an exposure. So just about here. And perhaps add a tiny bit of contrast using clarity. Having done that, hit the done button and look at the details. That looks fairly reasonable to begin with. Reasonable details all over. Just a tiny bit of highlight overexposure. This is a very simple fix. Once again, exposure adjustment brush. And what am I really looking for is kill the highlight. So I've got a brush which is about the same size as the necklace in there, and I apply it, and after having applied it, I can pull back some of the highlight, a little bit of the exposure, and maybe some of the white, and you notice how much cleaner it looks. Let's take a quick peek while we're at it at the fingers and the ring. So I'm going to apply the same setting here as well, very gently, so I'm getting a little more detail in here, and that looks okay. I mean, that's a very, very minor speck that can be fixed as well, but I think this will do for now. Click done, and once we're done, we go back and fit the image to see what changes we have made. Now, the one thing that I haven't done as yet is ensure that my white balance is correct. So I've done my basic adjustment. There may be more. So I'm going to take the white balance tool, and I'm going to see at what point do I get a mid-tone value. So around here, I'm in the 50s range. So if you notice, this was a neutral gray backdrop. So where my cursor is, and I look underneath the histogram, my red, green, and blue values, the blue seems to be higher. The red and green are pretty close to each other. So if I use this as my target, now I have exactly the same number of values across the board. But the image has gone a little pale, perhaps a little too pale. So this is where you can make your personal choices based on how well your monitor may be calibrated. So I am going to go back and add a tiny bit of blue back in there, just about 50, 100 or 200, somewhere in there. That's about it. And if I now look at the image, that looks reasonable, and the background 80, 81, 84, that is quite respectable. So overall, the feel of the image is quite okay. Now, when we start looking at the details over here, this could be purely personal choices because nice details are visible in here. So depending on what you may be using this image for, if it is going to go into print, for example, I would definitely pull a little more details in here, because in print the blacks tend to die out a little bit. And this seems pretty okay. All of this seems okay. I don't have a problem with this. And generally speaking, the image is pretty reasonable. Now what I wish to do is work a little bit on the eye region. Okay? So multiple ways. You could use the same exposure adjustment brush, or you could potentially use the radial filter. Personally, the radial filter, some people would prefer. I kind of like the adjustment brush. But this time around, I'm going to put the density back to around the 50s mark, and I'll use a small brush, okay? and my auto mask is constantly checked. So I am going to be painting just in the eye region, and just to ensure, I activate show mask so that you can see exactly where the image is painting in there. So I'm going to paint both the eyes. After having done that, I'll uncheck this, and then I'm going to open up the exposure a tiny bit, maybe add a bit of contrast, yeah, and a little bit of sharpness in the eyes, and maybe a tiny bit of clarity. And once done, hit done. And look at the overall image. Now in this particular image, there's a bit of sensor dust in here. So we can very comfortably clean this by using the Clone Heal tool, spot removal tool. So here, once you choose it, you have an option of cloning or healing. So I'm just going to leave it to heal. I'm going to add a bit of feathering to it, and opacity at 100%. The size seems okay. And I will simply click and drag it. So don't expect immediate responses, but you notice that bit has disappeared. And then done. So no more dust left whatsoever. Anything else that we can look into at this stage? Not really, not a whole lot. The shirt looks nice. It was a very pale, off-white, pinkish tone. So this has gone back a little bit, so I may wish to fix this a tiny bit again. So I take the adjustment brush, and it's right there. I'm going to increase the density, and maybe a slightly larger brush. And get rid of the highlights and the whites. Now we're talking. Now it's all good. So done once again. And there we go. So at a base level, the processing is reasonable. There's a lot more that can be done, but that is something that we'll be doing in Photoshop. So let's see that we are happy with this, and we wish to now save this as a preset so that we can apply it to the other image or other images that we may have shot in the same session with a similar lighting scenario. So there are the presets. Okay, so here's a plus symbol. If I click on it, it says either create, import, or manage. So I'm going to create a preset. Okay, so I'm just going to call it Jessica Demo, and I'm going to leave it there. Now let's go through this. So treatment and profile, yes. White balance, yes. Basic tone, which means exposure, contrast, highlights. White clipping, black clipping, yes. Color saturation, we haven't done very much, but we're going to leave it alone. No split toning. No, you don't want to add the graduated filters or the radial filters because they may be different from one image to another image. We haven't done any noise reduction, but we can leave it alone. Lens profile correction, absolutely yes. Lens correction, we haven't done any transform, we haven't done any effects, but the process version, calibration, tone curve, clarity, dehaze, sharpening, we're going to leave that alone. So once done, I'm going to say create. So what I've done is, in my user presets, here is that Jessica Demo preset that has been created for me. The one thing that I haven't done as yet is the sharpening. So whenever you decide and you're ready to sharpen an image, make sure that you're working at an enlarged view of the region that you're the most important in your image. Here is the facial region. So I'm going to collapse the basic, and I am going to go into the details. once I come into the details, I can always scroll through the preview here and bring it to the area that interests me and see what behavior it manifests. But the way that we're going to do it, we'll be able to see it immediately on screen as well. So the first thing that I would like to do is increase the amount of sharpening. So as I reduce and increase, you can see the difference, right? So reasonable amounts, and then add a little bit of radius. But before you click on the radius, press the Alt Option key, and keeping it depressed, you can then take the slider. And now if you notice carefully, I'm going to exaggerate it. You start to see the edges sharpen themselves. So you do it to a point which looks reasonable and not overdone. And the same applies to the details. So if I go too high, it looks very, very grumpy and textured. So you want to find the right balance. Once done, now I feel that perhaps I need to soften the skin a little bit, but everything else looks nice, the hair and everything else. So here's a masking slider. This is kind of cool. Pressing the Alt Option key, click on the slider and move it to the right. So wherever you see black, it is going to hide the influence. Wherever you see white is where it is going to impact and have a change. So my interest was to reduce the amount of sharpening, but leave sharpening in certain regions. So notice the skin has reverted back to its nice, clean, soft look, but the overall sharpness in the image and her hair and everything else seems to be fairly good. Once we have done this, perhaps I would like to overwrite the preset over here. So I am going to create a preset, and I am going to rename this preset exactly the same, and everything else, no noise reduction whatsoever. Lens da-di-da-di-da, sharpening, dehaze, process, and so on and so forth, all good. Create. So it tells me a preset with this name already exists. Do you want to replace? I will say yes, because I made the earlier preset in a bit of a rush. I should have been a little more patient. Now that I've done this, now it is time to export the image, and we're going to export this image in two versions. One as a Photoshop file in 16-bit to take advantage of the raw file, and then we're going to continue working with the image in Photoshop. And the other with the assumption that the image is done and I wish to save it as a JPEG file to be shared with a client or whoever. So I go to File and I go Export with Preset. So hopefully we have presets ready, and I've created two presets for myself. One is a JPEG Web Ready sRGB at 1920 pixels, and the other one is a Photoshop 16-bit ProPhoto RGB. Right? So before I do this, I just wanted to show you that I have the presets ready to go. What I wish to do is go to the other image and apply exactly the same preset. I may want to do minor tweaks, so the moment I apply it, because the exposures were slightly different, this seems a little overexposed. But when I look at the histogram, it is not that overexposed at all, but I still apply it. And then I can go and fine-tune it a tiny bit. So what am I looking for? Primarily, I don't want to open up the blacks as much. I want a little more tone in here, and some of the highlights can be pulled down a tiny bit. The whites are good, so there's good details. Now in this image there's a problem. There's a backlight which is showing through behind her. This is something that we're going to fix later on in Photoshop. There is a tiny bit of clipping in here, so what we're going to do is use a adjustment brush and increase the size of the brush, say show selected mask, and paint in here so you can see where I'm painting. Okay, and I have painted all these regions. Now, this is where we're going to go exploring another feature. My auto mask was checked. So this time, since it's fairly dark spaces that I am exploring, what I would like to do is use some of the new tools that are available. So I come into something called the range mask. So I'll scroll up so you can see better. And I say luminance because it's black and white that I'm interested in, and the luminance values are very low. So the range is 0 to 100. I am looking at a range of perhaps all the way down here. Okay, so hopefully this is making some sense, and we can fine-tune it by either going high or low. But here there's a bit of an influence. When I go low, it kind of tapers itself down. So once I have done it, then I can quite comfortably come up here and open up. Before I do that, switch this off so I can see exactly what I'm doing. So you notice how I have successfully eliminated any of that clipping and open up a combination of shadows, and not too much, otherwise it'll start looking washed out. So be careful how far you take it. So be patient, things take a little bit of time, and a little bit more, and perhaps close the shadows a tiny bit, and about there. So I may want to fine-tune it. So if I wish to fine-tune, what I can do is choose the erase one and really reduce the flow quite a ways down. Enlarge the brush, and once again, to show you the behavior, I'll say show selected. So when I bring it with a very low flow, it has a very, very minor influence on the overall image. And if I were to increase the flow, then things may change. So a little bit more. And it is having some minor influences. So it's still doing it. Let's say that I'm done with it. I uncheck it. And that looks pretty darn respectable. So I'll hit done and fit the image. Now when you look at the overall image, there's not many spaces that are out of range in any form, in terms of either clipping or in the highlights or in the shadows, because when I look at the histogram, it's just outside the clipping mark, and on the highlight region there's still room to play, but I'm leaving that alone. Now in this image we had not fixed or cleaned up the eyes, so everything else has been applied, but no custom adjustments have been applied. So I take the brush, auto mask, and a smaller brush, and once again I am looking to open up a tiny bit. There you go, you can see it as I paint gently. Done. And I uncheck this, and just the same way that I treated the other image, I'm going to add a touch of contrast and a bit of sharpness in the eyes so that there's a little more clarity in the eyes. And then done. And basically I am pretty much done with both these images. Now what I can do is select the two images that I have over here. I can go into File and Export with Preset. So first I'm going to export it into a folder that I've already created for the web images. So it's asking me, where do you wish to save it? So currently the folder that I have is called Raw for Digital Imaging and Stage 1. And notice there are two folders. One is for Lightroom, one is for Adobe Camear Raw. So I go into Lightroom and I'm saving JPEGs web ready. So I click on that folder and I hit open, and if you notice at the top left there's a progress bar, and it'll show you the progress of how the images are going. Now that the progress bar is nearly there and it's done, we are good to go to the next level, which is save both these files as Photoshop files. So again, File, Export with Preset, and this time I'm going to go PSD 16-bit Pro Photo. So Lightroom goes back to the last folder that you had used, so I'm going to modify that, and I'm going to change it to Stage 1, the folder, and there's Lightroom, and there are PSD files, and I hit open, and once again keep your eye on the progress bar to make sure that you don't rush into it, and just wait patiently for things to happen. We're halfway there, and it is done. Let's wait for it to disappear, and we are done with it. Okay, now what I'm going to do is push Lightroom away to my second screen, so you won't be able to see that, but the purpose is I would like to take whatever settings are here blindly and apply the same settings to images out of Adobe Camera Raw and see what they do. So I'm going to put this aside, and let me get it out of the way. There we go. And voila. And here are the same two images. Okay, so I'm selecting them both. I open them in Camera Raw, and just the way that we had started off with the first image, I am now active with the first image, which was this one, and my white balance is at, before I mess it up, enable profile, remove chromatic aberrations, and then go to basics. 5086, so 5086. Done. And the tint was at -14. Done. And my exposure is at plus 1.30, 1.30, and my contrast was to 0. My highlights are at -39, -39. My shadows are at plus 47, 47. My whites are at -26, and my blacks are at plus 60. And clarity, which is here, is at 8. So, very interesting. The image looks exactly the same. There is no difference whatsoever. Yes, we have not done any of the custom adjustments, which was primarily matching the hand and the facial color tone, for which we can use the brush and then work on it. Okay, and also if we come up closer, we may need to pull back and notice the same behavior, the little tiny white spots. So once again, we can take the adjustment brush and put everything to 0, and I will set exactly the same settings as we had in the Lightroom image, and all I have got there is -1.43 exposure. So I come back here, and I'm going to activate my mask, auto mask, and paint, so you can see. And again, the density I will go to about 50% and make sure that I paint with that density on. So having done that, there's no spill. I need to simply change my exposure to -1.43. Let's see what happens. So I'm going to switch off the mask, and negative 1.43. Done. Similar behavior. There's a little more detail in the jewelry and the diamond that she's potentially wearing here. Done. Now, we had also worked a little bit in the hair region and the necklace region. So the same readings will also apply potentially here. So I am going to apply the same brush, maybe increase my density and flow to have a greater influence in this region. And I think that is quite okay. We could add more flow and more density. And worst case scenario, we can do a second adjustment on top of it. Okay, so that's not such a big deal. Then we had done some adjustments to her eyes. Okay, so let me check what the adjustments on the eye are. So first let me paint. Okay, so I come back in here, I take a new brush, and I wish to paint, so I'm going to leave the mask so that we can see exactly what we are doing. So I messed up on one thing. My flow and density are very high. I was working in the 50 percentile range. So I'm going to go 50 and 50 and then paint. So you can see the behavior. Very similar. And both are painted. And then I will change the exposure adjustments exactly the same way. So I'm going to deactivate the mask so that I'm not distracted. Exposure was 1.03. 1.03. Contrast was at 60. And no highlights. And then the clarity was at 26. And sharpness at 82. And sharpness at 82. So exactly the same behavior, yet once again, the only thing that's left over is the hair region. Okay, so I'm not going to bother with that for now because it'll be exactly the same behavior, no changes whatsoever. Now that I have done this, I'm going to save this as a preset. So I first get out of here, and in here there's this icon which reflects the presets, and this little flyout over here, this is what allows you to create the presets. So I can say save settings, and once again the same behavior. So you can leave everything checked unless there's some specific adjustments that we have made with the brush, so these are not checked. So I'm not going to bother with that. I'm going to leave everything else, and I'm simply going to say save. And once again it asks me what you wish to save. So I am saving it here, and I'm saving it with my raw files as raw settings, and I save it. Once I'm done, now I wish to ensure that I'm able to save the image as a ProPhoto 16-bit PSD file, and another one as a JPEG 1920 pixels web ready with the appropriate profile. So before I do that, what I want to do is take this image or go to the other image and apply the preset. Or what I could do is click in here, select the other one, and then simply go into the flyout menu and say sync settings. And if you do that, it'll ask you what you're doing, blah 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 blah, and you do, and there we go. Exactly the same behavior where we needed to pull back some of the shadows, some of the blacks, and a bit of the exposure, and otherwise we are done. Okay, so now that we have done this, I'm going to select both images and click on the save images. So when I click on it, there are the same options as in the Lightroom's preset, so you can save it in here. Okay, So I already have one as a pro photo, right? I want to make this into a PSD file, number 2, and the profile would again be a pro photo profile, 300 pixels per inch, 16 bits per channel. So I could say, hey, let's save this one as a specific one. So I could again call it pro photo 16-bit PSD for no other reason other than just showing you how to do it. Where do I want to save it? Remember, I had created a new folder within that. So I'll go to my source, which was raw for DIP, stage 1, and ACR, and there's PSD. So I'll select. So now it is going to save this file with all of these changes as a PSD 16-bit and save. So notice now it's telling me 2 remaining, so it's working at it, and once you see that arrow, circular arrow stops moving, you should be done. So it has done that. So now I have saved both these files as PSD files. Next up, I want to create another set as web ready sRGB JPEGs. Okay? So I am going to modify things. First and foremost, select the folder. So I wish to select stage 1, ACR, JPEG web ready, and select. So the same folder has been selected. Here I'm going to change this to JPEG. Quality, I am going to change to a medium quality, and I'm going to let all the metadata go through. The profile that I want is an sRGB profile, 8 bits per channel, and I'm going to resize this image on the long side to 1920 pixels at 72 pixels per inch. Okay, so now I could save this as a new save preset, and I could call it web ready JPEG sRGB at 1920 pixels. Done. Hit OK, and notice now it shows up. So I've made this. It'll hopefully stay with my Photoshop for a fairly long time. I click save, and here it now says 2 images remaining, because now it is saving these files as JPEG web ready at 1920 pixels. So once I'm done with this, I hit done, and I'll also quit my Lightroom. So I'll bring Lightroom up over here. So here I bring up Lightroom, and this was Lightroom. We had made whatever changes, and you can compare the values, and once we're done with this, I can simply quit Lightroom. Gone. So let's see what is happening here. So this is ACR, this is Lightroom folder. So JPEG web ready, voila. And if we look at the metadata over here, you'll notice 1920 by 1280 at 224 kilobytes, 72 pixels per inch with an sRGB profile. And both the images would have the same profile. If now we went to the PSD folder, let's see what the behavior is. So here it tells me pro photo, and look at the file size, 139 plus megabytes at 300 pixels per inch. And the other one should be the same. Okay, now if we now say, okay, let's go look at the Lightroom folder, what do we have here? Same 2 images, 300 kilobytes, 72 pixels per inch, 1280 by 1920 at 72 ppi. Both the images. And if I now go to the PSD file It's the same, 139.60, minor changes, a few kilobytes here and there. And at 16-bit, oh, I made a mistake at 200. It should have been 300, but at least you now know what it is supposed to be. Okay, so I goofed up. Sorry for that. Hopefully this video helps you better understand how to use some of the tools at a basic level for raw processing, and also the fact that Lightroom, the develop module in Lightroom, and Adobe Camera Raw accessed through Bridge have exactly the same behavior. It is the same engine driving both of them. The only difference, once again, is the user interface. Thank you very much. Take care.